Hi again, everyone. Henry Hong, Director of Food and Beverage. This week, wanting to talk a little bit about local rye. So we have a couple of Maryland ryes here. I'll start off with something that's familiar to most people, the Sagamore Spirit Rye. This came on the market in 2016, marketed as the first, well, not the first, but sort of the rebirth of Maryland rye whiskey. Maryland was famous for its rye whiskey back in the 18th century. I'll explain why in a minute. But to call this a Maryland rye is not entirely accurate, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a second as well. So we have the Sagamore Spirit Rye, of course, Kevin Plank, Under Armour, etc., etc. And then we have maybe one you're not so familiar with. This is made by a company called Baltimore Spirit Company, and this is their rye they call Epoch Rye. This came onto the market in 2018. Very, very limited quantities at that point. It just now is commercially available this year, I think as of May or so. They started distributing to liquor stores and on-premise, like bars and restaurants and things like that. So a little bit easier to find now. Before, a couple months ago, the only way to get this stuff was to go to the distillery and wait in line when they had their releases, which I did every single time. I'm a big fan of this whiskey. But just going back to the Sagamore Spirit, real fast. So this is both a good and a bad example of Sagamore. So this, if you look at this label, the whole bottle looks a little bit different. This is back when I worked at Baltimore Country Club. We did a barrel pick where we were lucky enough to go to the Sagamore Farm up in Reisterstown, and their rick house, their storehouse. The guys over there would pick 4 barrels. We tasted from 4 barrels, and of the 4, this is barrel number 27, which we bought outright and then bottled. And you can see my initials there, like when we were actually putting the labels on and stuff. That barrel just blew away the other 3. It was and so much better. Tasted side by side with regular, just 80 proof Sagamore. So this is barrel strength, this is 110 proof, and it's something that I would refer to as a honey barrel. So within a rick house, there's some factors that really can affect how a whiskey ages. It's of course the juice that's going in there first, the actual distillate, but also the location in the rick house. So if it's higher up, it's going to get hotter during the hot months. If it's in the center of a big storehouse, the temperature fluctuations might not be as great as they might get on the edges near the walls. So all those things have an effect on how a whiskey ages. So in my opinion, this 27 was a honey barrel, and this is just outstanding whiskey. However, one thing to note about Sagamore Spirit, if you look at the back, I don't know if you can see that, in the tiniest font, it'll say bottled in Baltimore, but distilled in Indiana. So when you see a bottle of whiskey that says distilled in Indiana, that is a almost 100% chance of it being produced by a company called MGP, Midwest Grain Products. And what MGP does is their specialty is taking essentially recipes from producers and makers, blending it and aging it under contract essentially, and then it's bottled and distributed under various labels. And there's like probably 50 or 60 whiskey makers out there that use MGP's services because maybe they're not outfitted to distill their own or age their own stuff yet. And if you think about it, so I'll explain a little bit more when we get into the Baltimore Spirits Company, the Epoch Rye. It's a huge time investment. So, and when you're talking about a brown whiskey, everything starts off clear. It only turns brown after a certain amount of time in a charred oak barrel. So you're talking about if you're starting up a distillery, you can't even sell anything for the first 2 or 3 years, unless you're selling like moonshine, or a lot of places will sell vodka and rum and gin and things like that because you can sell that immediately. But a brown whiskey takes time that you're just sitting on your product. So a service like MGP just makes it easier to get the ball rolling. And I think there are plans for Sagamore to start distilling here in Maryland, but as far as I know, that hasn't happened yet. However, when we talk about this Epoch Rye, Baltimore Spirits Company, these guys, it's 3 dudes, I believe, and I was actually one of the early backers. They funded themselves via Kickstarter, among other funding avenues. But back in 2016, this is actually, I don't know if you can see that, but this says Batch 1. This is their very first release that went into barrels sometime in 2016, and then they tasted it constantly, and it was ready for release in August of 2018 was when this bottle finally got into my possession. And that's the year my son was born, so I'm waiting to drink this, open this up and drink it with him. I haven't decided how old he's going to be yet, but I'm thinking it's going to be before 21 because I don't want to wait that long. But in any case, these guys have their grain is all grown in Maryland, in Thurmont, in a farm. It is distilled here in Maryland, in Baltimore actually, and aged and then bottled. So this is a real homegrown operation. But a couple of quick things, Maryland rye was quite famous in the 18th century. But what made Maryland rye famous, or what made it so popular, as opposed to the Pennsylvania style or Old Monongahela, which is a river in western Pennsylvania, style of rye, was the fact that it was a little bit more drinkable. So when you're talking about rye whiskey, people will often describe the flavor as spicy. It definitely has a sharpness, and I'm not talking about alcohol burn, but just it's got kind of a raw grain flavor to it. Whereas when you're talking about corn, like a bourbon, it tends to be sweeter. So the Maryland style rye was actually a greater proportion of corn to rye. Often I believe that it was around 60-40, 60% rye, 40% corn in the mash bill for a Maryland style rye, whereas the Pennsylvania style rye is actually almost entirely rye. So this epoch is 95% rye and 5% malted barley. You'll see that often in mash bills. 5% the malted barley is added to kick off the fermentation process. For Sagamore, it's a little more complicated. This is actually they're a little bit secretive about their mash bills, but it's a blend of two styles of rye. So the one is actually a Pennsylvania style where it's a very, very high rye content. And then the other is a Maryland style where it has a little bit more corn content. And then those two are blended together to form the final Sagamore product. And then, so again, this is a barrel pick, so this is not cut to proof. The one thing that is Maryland based that makes regular Sagamore rye a Maryland product is that the spring water from the farm, from Sagamore Farm, actually when we went to the spring house, tasted the water, it's just coming up from the ground. That spring water is used to cut regular Sagamore rye down to 80%. 80 proof, 40% alcohol. And frankly, I think that kind of it makes the end product a lot less interesting than the barrel strength. So I'm going to try to dig up an extra bottle of this. If I can find one, I'm going to bring it to the club so we can taste. I'd love to taste you guys on the regular Sagamore versus the regular Epoch rye, versus even we have some old bottles of Pikesville rye, which if you were familiar with, that was actually distilled in Pikesville, Maryland, Scotts Level Road. I couldn't believe it because I grew up sort of down the street in that neighborhood, and then eventually moved to Baltimore, and then was eventually bought out by a Kentucky company. So it was very affordable. Remember the white plastic caps and the white labels? That went away, I believe, in 2016 as well. And it was reintroduced as a kind of a premium rye, and kind of a higher proof. It's got a lot of burn to it. Very, very different than the original one. It's aged longer. It's 3 years. It's 6 years as opposed to the original's 3 years, and it's probably like triple or quadruple the original price. But in any case, we have those ryes in the club, and I'm telling you, if you taste them side by side, you will be astounded at the difference. And I'd be very interested to see what everyone's sort of preferences on a blind tasting. But in any case, yeah, Maryland rye. I wrote actually an article about rye and its origins and history in this part of the country for Chesapeake Bay Magazine. There should be a link included with the email that's going out. And yeah, please, when next time I see you, come grab me and we'll take some rye together, some Maryland rye. Thanks.